The idea sounds impossible at first, yet the question refuses to disappear. Could an entire population of giants have once lived at the edge of the known world? What if the old sailors were not lying? What if the exaggerated stories were not exaggerations at all? And why are archives that denied this topic for centuries now beginning to open in unexpected ways? These questions feel unsettling because they challenge a quiet assumption woven into modern culture. We tend to believe that the past was smaller, simpler, and physically familiar. Yet several expeditions to Patagonia described humans nearly twice the height of the average European observer, and these reports were documented with the same discipline used for weather logs and navigation records. Recent archaeological and geological surveys, highlighted across multiple international news outlets, have intensified the puzzle. Updated satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar scans revealed anomalous underground cavities in southern Patagonia. Their dimensions resemble large communal dwellings rather than natural formations. Local research teams interviewed by reputable science-focused newspapers noted that the soil layers surrounding these cavities contain burned organic material dated to roughly 5 centuries ago. The samples are still under review, but the early numbers are consistent enough to raise genuine academic interest. Why does this matter so much? Because these early results echo the testimonies of explorers who described unusually tall groups living in the same region. If the physical evidence aligns even partially with the historical accounts, it forces a reconsideration of whether the line between myth and ethnography was much thinner than expected. Before moving toward any conclusion, it helps to focus on what can actually be confirmed. Eyewitnesses left similar descriptions decades apart, yet none were able to provide direct anatomical measurements. Archaeologists studying the new findings emphasize that unusual structures do not automatically imply unusual people. At the same time, ignoring converging patterns of testimony and terrain would be an equally careless approach. The question persists because it taps into a deeper cultural uncertainty. What other elements of human history have been simplified, compressed, or quietly dismissed? And if this mystery is ever resolved, what other long-buried stories might rise with it? The curiosity surrounding Patagonia continues to grow, strengthened by new fieldwork, new technologies, and a public appetite for truths once considered unreachable. Everything about this subject suggests that the full explanation lies further beneath the surface, waiting for careful and patient examination. The trail of clues emerging from Patagonia points in several different directions, each one hinting at a larger pattern still hidden beneath fragmented evidence. Some of the earliest reports describe encounters so unusual that modern readers often dismiss them immediately. Yet the consistency of these accounts suggests that something extraordinary once existed in the region. What that something truly was remains uncertain, but the pieces now forming invite a deeper look. As the investigation unfolds, several themes begin to surface. There are the historical testimonies recorded by disciplined navigators. There are the unusual geological structures detected by modern scanning equipment. And there are cultural references scattered across indigenous traditions that may hold clues long overlooked. Taken together, these threads create a landscape of unanswered questions far richer than the simplified versions found in school textbooks. In the sections ahead, the narrative will move from the early eyewitness claims to the mechanisms that could explain how such stories formed. The examination will then shift toward physical evidence, alternative interpretations, and the limits of what current science can verify. Each step builds toward the central question raised at the beginning, but the full answer remains momentarily out of reach. This topic invites careful attention because it connects imagination with measurable data. Some possibilities will appear familiar, grounded in what archaeology already recognizes. Others will feel more provocative, challenging long-standing assumptions about who lived in the far south of the Americas and what kind of societies they built. The intrigue lies in how these possibilities intersect and diverge. What becomes clear is that understanding this mystery requires a wider and more flexible perspective. The coming analysis will move through historical records, scientific methodologies, and cultural memory, gradually revealing how multiple layers of information shape one another. The resolution is not yet visible, but the path toward it is beginning to form. Legends of giants often sound like exaggerations because they clash with everyday experience, so it helps to begin with a simple comparison. Imagine walking into a crowded street where everyone is nearly twice your height. The immediate impression would not be a subtle one. It would feel like stepping into a different human world entirely. This sense of scale is at the heart of why early explorers described the people of Patagonia with such astonishment. Behind the dramatic language, however, lies a more technical question. How could different observers, separated by decades, arrive at similar descriptions? One explanation involves a concept known in anthropology as perceptual bias, where extreme environmental conditions or unfamiliar body proportions distort height estimation. This is not speculation but a documented mechanism. In open, windswept landscapes, visual distance can trick the eye into overestimating size. Researchers studying the phenomenon have shown that the same effect can occur when clothing alters the outline of the body, making figures appear taller or broader. Yet perceptual bias alone cannot fully explain why several navigators wrote similar measurements in their journals. This brings us to another mechanism, sometimes called observational convergence. When independent witnesses report comparable details despite lacking contact with one another, analysts examine whether the similarity arises from a shared external trigger rather than imagination. In historical research, this convergence is treated as a signal worth investigating, but it is never considered definitive on its own. A different line of reasoning focuses on physical anthropology. Certain populations around the world have historically exhibited above-average stature due to genetics, diet, or regional adaptation. The idea is not extraordinary by itself. For example, modern height variations between populations can differ by as much as 15 to 20% depending on nutrition and genetic factors. Applying this framework to Patagonia means exploring whether a group with naturally elevated height once lived there and whether early sailors interpreted these differences through the lens of their own expectations. These mechanisms create room for debate because each one could operate independently or overlap with the others. Some may argue that exaggeration played a larger role, while others point to the consistency across accounts. The tension between these interpretations is precisely what fuels modern discussions in academic forums and comment sections alike. The discussion becomes even more interesting when geological context is added. A region defined by vast plains, sudden cliffs, and extreme weather can influence how bodies move, appear, and are perceived at a distance. Geologists studying Patagonia often note that its unusual landscapes have shaped local survival strategies for centuries. Such environmental pressures can produce cultural and physical adaptations that outsiders find striking. Do these mechanisms solve the mystery? Not yet, but they outline the possible processes that could shape eyewitness testimonies, and they create the foundation needed to evaluate the evidence that follows. Expeditions that reached Patagonia recorded several observations that continue to puzzle researchers today. The first comes from multiple ship logs written between the 16th and 18th centuries. These documents contain repeated descriptions of individuals significantly taller than the average European, sometimes noted as a full head and shoulders above the tallest crewman. What makes these records noteworthy is their consistency across different vessels, navigating under different commanders and arriving in different decades. Such uniformity suggests that the observers were not simply copying one another's stories, but reacting to something they all perceived as unusual. A second observation arises from recent archaeological surveys that have been highlighted by several international science outlets. Ground-penetrating radar revealed large subsurface cavities arranged in patterns resembling communal living structures rather than random geological spaces. Archaeologists studying the formations emphasized that their scale exceeded what is expected for typical shelters of the region. The surrounding soil contained remnants of controlled fire use, tentatively dated to around 500 years ago, further indicating organized habitation rather than natural accidents. A third point of interest comes from osteological fragments found in scattered locations across southern Patagonia. The remains are too incomplete to make firm biological claims, yet a few long bone segments appear proportionally larger than the standard range known from comparative skeletal collections. Researchers caution that erosion, animal activity, and soil pressure can distort size, but the pattern has drawn attention because the affected fragments come from different sites rather than a single anomalous location. A fourth line of evidence comes from indigenous oral traditions. Several communities in the region preserve stories describing ancestors or neighboring groups of exceptional height, often associated with hunting prowess and territorial dominance. These accounts do not match one another in every detail, yet the recurring theme of unusual stature is difficult to ignore. Anthropologists generally interpret such narratives symbolically, but they acknowledge that mythic retellings can preserve kernels of historical memory, especially when multiple groups share parallel motifs. A final observation relates to environmental adaptation. Studies on human populations exposed to extreme climates, such as high winds, long-distance migrations, and calorie-scarce ecosystems, have shown measurable effects on body proportions across generations. Gas exchange efficiency, limb-to-torso ratios, and musculature can shift in response to persistent environmental stress. Some researchers speculate that Patagonia's harsh ecology could have pushed certain groups toward physical adaptations that outsiders later described in exaggerated terms. Each of these observations carries its own weight, yet none provides a complete explanation. Taken together, however, they form a cluster of signals that invites deeper investigation and a more careful reading of both historical records and modern field data. One way to approach the giant claims of Patagonia is to begin with the simplest explanation and then work outward. The first and most conservative model is the null hypothesis, that early explorers misjudged height due to environmental distortion, unfamiliar clothing, or cultural bias. This hypothesis assumes no extraordinary human physiology and frames the accounts as products of perception rather than anatomy. It aligns with documented cases where travelers in unfamiliar landscapes misinterpreted size, distance, or proportion. The strength of this explanation is that it requires no new assumptions. Its weakness is that it struggles to explain why independent observers, separated by decades, gave similar descriptions with similar scale differences. A second explanation emphasizes narrative inflation. Stories passed through sailors' circles often grew more dramatic with each retelling, especially when they involved remote regions at the edge of the mapped world. It is entirely plausible that an encounter with a tall but ordinary population gradually transformed into the idea of a people of exceptional size. This model accounts for the emotional pressure of long voyages, where extraordinary stories offered social capital among crews. Yet it does not fully address the earliest reports, those written before such tales circulated widely, and these primary accounts remain difficult to fit neatly into a folklore framework. A third, more moderate explanation argues for the presence of a population with naturally above-average height. Human groups around the world have occasionally exhibited exceptional stature due to genetic clusters, protein-rich diets, or selective pressures. Under this interpretation, the explorers encountered a tall population that seemed even more imposing through the lens of European expectations. This model fits well with anthropological data showing large variations in height across historical populations. Its limitation is that skeletal evidence in Patagonia remains incomplete and does not yet confirm such a population conclusively. A fourth possibility involves selective survival of oral traditions. Indigenous stories from the region often describe tall ancestral groups, but these narratives may not be literal biographies. They could represent symbolic memory, echoes of conflict, migration, or dominance rather than physical height. In many cultures, describing an opposing group as giants reflects their perceived power rather than their body size. The strength of this model is its cultural grounding. Its weakness is that it does not explain the archaeological anomalies currently being surveyed. A fifth explanation moves toward geological and environmental factors. It suggests that early observers saw distant figures distorted through mirages, wind-driven dust, and shifting coastal light, conditions that can elongate silhouettes and exaggerate height. Meteorologists in similarly harsh regions have documented optical effects that alter perceived body proportions. While this is a compelling mechanism, it struggles to explain close-range encounters described in several logs. None of these explanations can be dismissed outright, and none fully resolves the inconsistencies in the evidence. The issue becomes a balancing act between conservative and more speculative interpretations, each one capturing part of the puzzle but not the entire picture. What stands out is that the strongest model may not be a single explanation but an interaction of several factors, perceptual, cultural, and environmental, shaping how the region's inhabitants were described and remembered. Several gaps in knowledge continue to shape the uncertainty surrounding the accounts from Patagonia. The most immediate is the absence of complete skeletal remains that can provide reliable measurements. Archaeological teams have uncovered fragments, but none are intact enough to establish population-wide stature with scientific confidence. Without full anatomical samples, estimates remain provisional, and any strong conclusion risks exceeding the data. A second gap concerns the chronology of habitation sites. Dating methods applied to burned organic material and soil layers can produce ranges rather than precise timestamps, especially in regions shaped by shifting winds and intense erosion. If the dating intervals are too broad, it becomes difficult to determine whether the structures discovered in recent surveys belong to a single cultural group, several consecutive groups, or unrelated episodes of settlement. This uncertainty limits how tightly physical evidence can be matched with historical eyewitness accounts. A third missing piece involves cultural context. Indigenous oral traditions contain references that might preserve echoes of earlier societies. Yet these traditions have evolved over centuries. Many narratives blend symbolic, spiritual, and historical elements in ways that are difficult to disentangle. Anthropologists can analyze patterns but cannot always determine which components represent literal memory and which reflect cultural metaphor. This ambiguity creates room for interpretation but little firm ground for definitive claims. There is also a methodological gap tied to early European reports. Most journals record impressions rather than standardized measurements. Distances, lighting conditions, and psychological pressures of exploration were rarely documented with enough detail to reconstruct the observational environment. As a result, modern analysts must infer the conditions under which these impressions were formed, and those reconstructions inevitably involve uncertainty. The final layer of unknowns arises from the landscape itself. Patagonia is vast, sparsely populated, and shaped by extreme weather. Large regions have never been systematically surveyed with modern tools such as LiDAR or deep penetration ground radar. Until such technologies are applied broadly, It is impossible to know whether the anomalies recently detected represent isolated curiosities or fragments of a much larger and still hidden archaeological record. These blind spots create a scientific environment where multiple interpretations remain viable. To move beyond speculation, research teams would need complete skeletal material, more precise dating, wider mapping coverage, and deeper cultural analysis. Only a combination of these factors can narrow the range of possibilities and bring the underlying reality into sharper focus. The early questions asked whether entire communities of unusually tall people once lived in Patagonia, and whether the dramatic claims recorded by explorers contained any truth. Answering these questions requires moving beyond impressions and examining how the mechanisms, evidence, and uncertainties fit together. The first point is that eyewitness reports, though imperfect, were not random inventions. They were recorded by navigators trained to observe their surroundings with discipline. These records consistently describe individuals significantly taller than the tallest men aboard their ships. While perception can distort height, the uniformity across independent accounts suggests that the observers encountered a population whose stature genuinely differed from what they considered normal. Historical variability in human height provides an important context. Some populations throughout history have exhibited remarkable physical differences, sometimes driven by diet, sometimes by genetics, sometimes by environmental pressures. If a group in Patagonia possessed naturally elevated stature, even by modern standards, European observers accustomed to shorter average height would have interpreted them as extraordinary. This explanation does not require mythical proportions, only a statistically tall population whose appearance would have felt striking and unfamiliar. The archaeological findings support this interpretation in indirect ways. The large subsurface structures detected through ground-penetrating radar do not prove the existence of giants, but they indicate organized habitation on a scale unusual for the region. Combined with burned organic material dated to roughly 500 years ago, the evidence suggests the presence of a structured society whose characteristics have not yet been fully documented. Incomplete bone fragments showing larger-than-average proportions cannot serve as proof, yet they reinforce the possibility that early eyewitnesses encountered individuals whose height landed at the upper end of human variation. Cultural testimony also plays a role. Indigenous groups maintain stories describing tall ancestral or neighboring peoples. Such narratives are not biological reports, but they do hint at long-standing cultural memory shaped around encounters with groups perceived as physically imposing. When separate communities preserve similar motifs, historians sometimes treat these echoes as reflections of real encounters, filtered through symbolic language. Environmental distortion, storytelling inflation, and perceptual bias all remain viable components of the explanation. Yet none of them fully eliminates the possibility that early explorers met a population that exceeded European norms for height. When considered together, the most consistent conclusion is that Patagonia likely hosted a group whose stature was noticeably above average, amplified by environmental conditions and cultural expectations until the accounts took on legendary form. So were the Patagonia giants real in the literal sense of towering mythic beings? The evidence does not support that idea. Were they real in the sense of a population significantly taller than the observers who wrote about them? The combination of historical reports, cultural memory, environmental adaptation, and fragmentary physical evidence makes that interpretation not only plausible but statistically reasonable. The legends may have stretched the truth, but they were not built from nothing. The long-standing mystery becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. Not a world of supernatural beings, but a world of human variation so striking that it reshaped centuries of storytelling and exploration. The idea that explorers might have encountered unusually tall people in Patagonia opens a wider reflection about how human beings interpret the unfamiliar. History often progresses by replacing dramatic myths with measurable facts. Yet the opposite also happens. Simple realities become exaggerated through time until they resemble legends. Somewhere between these two tendencies lies the truth of many ancient stories. In this case, the evidence points not to impossibilities, but to a reminder that human diversity is broader than comfortable assumptions often allow. Thinking about these accounts also reveals how easily cultures overlook the limits of their own perspective. Early Europeans arriving in remote regions carried expectations formed by their homes, their diets, and their daily environments. Encountering a population shaped by different pressures, nutrition, climate, genetics, would have challenged the mental models they considered universal. The resulting stories, amplified by distance and uncertainty, influenced how later generations imagined the far southern edge of the world. There is also something quietly human in the persistence of this mystery. People instinctively look for meaning in fragments of evidence, especially when those fragments hint at hidden chapters of our shared past. The combination of curiosity, skepticism, and imagination creates a tension that fuels both scientific inquiry and storytelling. Understanding that balance helps explain why the question of the Patagonia giants has endured for centuries. The topic ultimately invites humility. Even with modern tools, vast landscapes remain only partially explored, and much of human history has yet to be uncovered or understood. The gaps in evidence do not weaken the desire to learn. They deepen it. They remind us that the world still contains unanswered questions, and that certainty is often less important than the willingness to investigate honestly. What remains clear is that history is rarely as small or predictable as textbooks suggest. Unexpected discoveries, both large and subtle, continue to reshape what we think we know about ancient civilizations and the people who inhabited them. Each new clue from Patagonia contributes to a broader understanding of cultural variation, human adaptation, and the complex interplay between observation and myth. Thank you for joining this exploration and for taking the time to follow the evidence with patience and curiosity. If you found this journey meaningful, consider supporting the work by subscribing to the channel. Your interest helps bring these hidden stories of the past into clearer focus for future audiences.